So, good afternoon. If you've ever wondered how to eat healthy and also have food that tastes good, then check out these tips because we're going to give you some quick and easy ways that you can improve the foods you eat so that you don't have to worry about lacking flavor, boring foods, or anything like that ever again. And in fact, let me just adjust my screen so I'm putting better. There we go. Oh, good. Oh, good. So these tips are things that you can do really easy and with anything. Okay. So, for example, you may have say some carrots in the fridge or cupboard. And you may sit there and think, how can I make these taste different? Because there's nothing worse than literally having a plate which had boiled veg on because it just tastes boring and plain and bland and sometimes can really lack flavor. So of course, these tips are things that you can easily do. Now, first one, we're going to talk about the sort of spicing of foods, okay, as we cook it. Now, one way to sort of bring out the flavor in foods is by adding spices. So we have two options here. We have dry and we have fresh. Okay. The one nice thing about fresh herbs and things like that to season is the flavors much stronger. So also you could say, for example, have a coriander plant in your kitchen, which is obviously super cool. And that means you've got this sort of recurring supply. Depends how much you grow, but you could have a little herb garden. Okay. And these things are super refreshing, super healthy, doesn't add really any calories or any negative or anything like that, but adds and boosts flavor in your meal. Okay, this is why we also talk about complementary spices and things like that. Now, not all of us have the space, capacity, or whatever for plants. Okay, I actually killed a mint plant in my last house, so that's why I've kind of stepped away from it. But you can have dried herbs and spices. Now, the beautiful thing is, even though dried herbs and spices have a best before date on, they actually can be used for a lot longer. So although it is your choice, I'm not telling you have to go against this or not, but if you go further than the best before date, then of course the strength and flavor can just drop. Doesn't mean they're no good, okay? But this way you could have a little tray in the cupboard. That's why I have my kitchen of all the different ones that you want to use and can use. So I have things like cumin, turmeric, I'm trying to think, basil, parsley, oregano, Italian spices. So all these things are in there. So I could literally easily add them to a meal. So for example, last night I'm cooking up some tofu. As I'm cooking up the tofu, I add a bit of cumin. Okay, so that's very good for sort of body fat and things like this. But it also adds a little bit of tang to my foods. So I'm cooking up in the tofu. So if anyone's eaten tofu, tofu is kind of bland. It is bland. There isn't really a flavor to it unless you put a flavor to it. Okay. So I'm cooking out with this. Then I added my veggies with courgettes and things like this. And then I add in a couple of other things, which I'll come on to. Okay. But you can easily just add it in the different stages of cooking to bring out different flavors to different foods or with different things. So when I make a risotto, for example, I'll use some onions and garlic and roast it in the pan first of all. And if you look at any recipe for a great risotto, you're building this flavor and you'll smell it, that really beautiful roast onion and garlic smell. You'll smell these flavors coming out. And then what you put in your mushrooms and then stock and then everything else, right? So it's all about the flavor. So of course there's different stages of cooking. So when I make a sort of a pasta sauce, so remember I said I've got Italian spices. So when I make like a homemade bolognese, I actually put my Italian spices in quite early on, but then I'll add a little bit more basil and parsley towards the later stage of cooking just to bring out that extra little bit of flavor. Okay, so you can choose a combination. You don't necessarily have to pile loads in or anything like that, but even a little bit can go a long way. All right, so that's our herbs and spices, which are a fantastic and super easy way to put in. But remember I said there was two other things I put into my food last night. One of those was salt. So I only add salt slightly when I'm cooking. And the reason is salt can help bring out the flavor of foods. All right, so if you're adding a little salt as it's cooking, then of course it can help those flavors to come out. Okay, and remember, a little salt generally is okay. All right, if you're then putting loads and loads on the table, okay, I would check how much you're putting into your diet because we don't want high levels of sodium. But a little bit while you're cooking can actually boost flavor and obviously put a little bit into your diet, which is healthy. Okay. The other thing I put in was pepper, that nice peppery flavor and taste. The other thing I really like to add pepper to is when I'm doing like scrambled eggs. Okay. So as I got the eggs and threw them in the pan, obviously you know what I mean. Turn in the black pepper grinder and obviously grinding in some black pepper too. It's really, really beautiful. Okay. So again, it has that little bit of a flavor and a tang. All right. Now, that leads me nicely on to mustard. So I'm not a big fan of mustard. I don't know how you feel. Like my dad would always put it on the side of a plate, especially when you're having certain meats and things like this, right? But for me, it's never really been a thing that I've kind of enjoyed. See what we say? However, when it comes down to adding a little flavor, then of course mustards can be a fantastic thing to add. Okay. So for example, if we're doing one thing I learned from one of my clients for like a lunchtime thing is a grilled cheese sandwich. So very American in that respect, but obviously doing it, but putting a little bit of mustard on the inside and then obviously adding the flavors and things like this. And actually when you get this, it all done, it's all melted together and it's all grilled and everything. It's actually really, really nice. It adds a bit of a spice and everything to the sandwich itself. So it can be a really easy way to put a flavor in without suddenly having to look at food and going, okay, all I want is a cheese and tomato toasty. What can I do with it? Add a little, like I said, only a little, thin, very thin, and it can actually boost a flavor and a tang to what's coming out. Okay. So if you are with me, guys, so far we've hit onto the spices, which are fantastic. So we've got the fresh spices, which you can obviously grow in herbs, or of course dried, which lasts for a very long time. Salt, which brings out flavor as we're cooking, and of course pepper, which again has that peppery flavor and those beautiful senses get tingled. But of course, mustard is a great one to sort of bring in. So you can mix mustard with several different things. But my personal favorite is that sort of say toasted cheese and tomato sandwich, just adding that little bit and having that little bit extra flavor. All right. So the next one I'm going to lead you on is staying on the sort of the sandwiches, the sort of snacky sort of things. And that's obviously our citrus flavors, okay? Because lemon and even orange and lime have these amazing sort of zesty flavors. Okay, I say zesty because they are super nice. So if you're making a stir fry, if you squeeze in a bit of lemon, oh my God, it just sets a light. Or on a salad. Okay, so actually using a citrus or lemon juice is a beautiful salad dressing. So adds a little bit of tang and flavor to it. There's nothing wrong with saying having loads squeeze in the fridge or just using a little bit or things like this because it can add a little bit of flavor. But you notice how often lemon is obviously put with fish, and that's a flavor thing. Okay, so you might not be for everybody. You may want to put it in at the cooking stage, you may want to put it in at serving. Either way, find what adds that little taste buds tinkle for you. Okay, because then that way you're more likely to enjoy that little bit of say salad or whichever you're choosing to eat, or even that fish, and add those extra flavors. And of course, all those loaded goodness what you get from having those citrus fruits, because they are added with value, vitamin C's and all this sort of stuff. So it's a great thing to stack into the diet. Now, making sure I don't miss out. Okay, so we're going on to sauces now. Okay, because if you followed any sort of diet plan, I mean, I did it. I did Weight Watchers years ago. Like I said, I did no points to support my friend. And when I did Weight Watchers, obviously sauces is one of the big things that you kind of get identified with, right? So I remember then stopping cut because I was always I'll buy a pasta sauce, whatever, done, right? And of course, one of the ways that I reduced sort of the food calories and all the negative stuff that I was eating was actually changing the sauces. Now, in that, I mean, I tend to do homemade ones. So you can easily buy a tin of chopped tomatoes, okay? Now, you can do tomato puree. If you do the puree, obviously you need generally the concentrate to thicken it as you cook. All right, so bear in mind, depends on what you're cooking to what you might choose. I like the chopped tomatoes and generally have some in the cupboard because one, they last forever. Okay. Secondly, they're not that expensive. So if you're someone on a budget, then of course they're a nice, easy way to add a little bit of liquids and something, but also add flavor. And of course, you can spice them up and add some flavor. Depends on what you're cooking. So if we're going for like a pasta dish, then of course get some chopped tomatoes. You can obviously put some Italian spice, like I was saying earlier, put the basil, the parsley in, bit of pepper, bit of salt, obviously as it's cooking, load in all my vegetables. But one thing I also like to do is I like to make these big sort of one pot dishes, okay? But I say big one pot because actually it's sort of about 2 or 3 meals in one, okay? Or 4 if you were having, say, a side vegetable or something with it, okay? But I put in these, I'll put some sort of protein, so like lentils, chickpeas or something. I'll obviously the chopped tomatoes and obviously seasoning would go in, but then I'll put in all my vegetables. So the last one I made had spinach, cauliflower, onion, some carrot, and some leeks, and I just threw this all in together. And of course, obviously, baking it in the oven. So the negative is that it can take a long time to cook. However, if you're someone like me who batch cookies, I'm talking about cookies now, cooks quite a lot, then this is a great thing to do because you can make this as you're cooking something else. So for example, I may roast a whole tray of vegetables, do one of these pots and some protein. And then of course I've got half the veggies and the protein, say for dinner. This box that I've cooked up is say lunch the next day, maybe a dinner the next day or a lunch the day after. So I've got a couple of days of meals there. So it saves me cooking. So although my oven may be going for like an hour and a quarter while it's all cooking up, that's one cooking time to do about 4 or 5 meals. Okay. So this is where we plan ahead. Okay. Because one, none of us have the time to spend half an hour to an hour in the kitchen every single day. Generally speaking, if we have a full-time job, and especially if we have a full-time job with a family, okay, you haven't got the time to be spending an hour in the kitchen every day to cook, okay? So there are ways that you can take around it, maybe investing on a Sunday, a little bit of time in prep or things like this, but of course, this batch cooking and actually really flavoring the food as you cook means that when you eat it a day or two later, it's not some soggy mush that sits in the fridge. Okay, now I'll give you one example of this. Okay, so I went out for a meal at one point. I'm not going to tell you when or where because you might track where I was, but and I don't. They're a really nice place. That's why I'm not that you can track me, but the place we went to was a really nice place, but the food was very poor. Now, being a vegetarian, I had the ratatouille. That was their vegetarian option, was ratatouille. If anyone's done a ratatouille, I will. In fact, I'll put a recipe up for this because ratatouille is basically a load of vegetables. That's all it is. Plate of vegetables like baked up. All right. Now, the plate I had was basically lacking flavor, overcooked. And I'm sat there going, it's one of the easiest dishes that you can make. But if you don't put any thought into adding flavor, then of course it turns into basically a plate of mush. And it's very tasteless and it feels very difficult to get through it. Okay, but that's where things like the right spices, like as I mentioned before, those fresh herbs and spices, the dried ones maybe within the cupboard, using a bit of salt, pepper, spicing it up, and you can add a bit of tang. Okay, but like I said, we were talking about sauces. Okay, so remember I said about the pasta sauce and doing this bake, and you can make it the sauce, adding the flavor. All right, but the other thing is hot sauces. So we've all seen them a little bit: Tabasco, Worcester sauce, these sorts of things. So you can literally add a drop or two, and it can bring out a flavor. Okay, again, it's like a different way of spicing or zesting. You can use this as a table condiment. So I know people that use it like as ketchup. Okay, but I also personally, I've got Tabasco in the cupboard, and generally speaking, I add it in towards the later stages of cooking. Okay, but like if I was doing a stir fry, Worcester sauce, again, it's another sort of flavoursome. And before anyone else, obviously, if you are vegetarian, there are veggie options, but I'm vegetarian because I don't like meat or fish, so I have no problem with Worcester sauce. Picking up on that one. Okay, so when we're talking about the different things that we're sort of eating, you can go, okay, I'm vegetarian. I can't add Worcester sauce because it's got fish in it. It's fish elements, fish juices. Okay. If you're like me and you're vegetarian because you simply don't like the taste and texture of meat, then you may choose to progress and go, okay, I'll put it in a cooking. It's okay. Right. Or you may go, okay, have a look at the other labels because there are vegetarian and vegan options these days. There is plenty out there where you can add a little bit more flavor. Okay, now the last one, and obviously that's the soy sauce as well. Okay, now the last one I was going to give you, which is one of my favorites to add in, and it's obviously on the fresh line again, and that is fresh ginger. Okay, so fresh ginger, like having a turmeric, lemon, and stuff like this, can add such nice flavors to food. So if you ever think about having a ginger cookie and things like this, you know, the sort of flavors, or ginger tea, imagine having a sort of a bit of a tang to your food. So particularly when we have stir fries or say Chinese food, you may find that obviously ginger and things like that occur. Okay, there are loads of other dishes I do know that do add ginger, But these are why we can have a takeaway for someone and go, oh my God, this is amazing. It may be something simple as a few herbs, a few spices, a little lemon, and some ginger has been added to the meal. So rather than sticking to the bog standard, getting a boring meal and things like that, just think, okay, what can I add to add a little flavour to this? So if you're roasting foods, maybe add a bit of herbs as the roasting. As you're starting to bake something, add a little bit of flavour as it's being served. Or maybe think about doing a little sauce, sort of dressing for it. So guys, if you have found that useful, obviously do let me know. Let me know your thoughts, comments, questions. And of course, hopefully, if you do like this, you hit that like button. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you next week and in the next session.